Neo-Victorian reconstructions and adaptations of the past in Alan Moore's and Eddie Campbell's From Hell, Comics in Dialogue Conference. Published in 16 installments, a prototypically Victorian form, Alan Moore's and Eddie Campbell's From Hell has been considered a masterpiece of the graphic novel as a hybrid artistic and literary form. Alan Moore is celebrated nowadays not only as a great author in the sphere of comics, but also in that of literature in general terms. As a matter of fact, he has contributed to knock down the barriers between high and low culture as the writer of cult series like V for Vendetta, Saga of the Swamp Thing, Watchmen, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, among others. Throughout his remarkable career, Moore has shown a recurrent obsession with the Victorian era, some of his writings revealing unmistakably neo-Victorian themes and styles. For instance, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen features a group of Victorian superheroes, all of them coming from literary works of late Victorianism. Rider Haggard's Alan Quatermain, H.G. Wells's Invisible Man, Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's Dorian Gray, and Bram Stoker's Mina Murray from Dracula. A veritable erudite, Alan Moore fills up his creations with an intertextual framework of cultural sources, ranging from the literary to the philosophical, through the artistic, the historical, the esoteric, and the scientific. In this respect, From Hell arguably provides the best example of his successful trajectory so far, establishing a paradigm of Moore's method of careful and meticulous research, shared in this case by artist Eddie Campbell, whose panels and illustrations reflect with a high degree of fidelity and artistic scrupulousness the sequence of allegedly historical events, the characters' psychological drives and reactions, and the sinuous geographies of London, the multifarious setting of this foray into the inevitable decline and fall of an empire sick to the core. The vast bulk of research of both writer and artist is mostly exhibited in the copious annotations to the chapters contained in Appendix 1 of From Hell, and in the invaluable companion to the graphic novel published in 2013. In Alan Moore's view, the Victorian past contains the seed of our postmodern present. In this case, the historical structure resembles that of the ominous churches of Nicholas Hawksmoor, whose elongated and uncanny steeples, crowned by obelisks, proliferate on the pages of the graphic novel as a reminder of the influence of artistic forms on people's attitudes and behavior. Moore's and Campbell's achievement retrieves the Victorian past in a complex search for the origins of present-day evils. By focusing on the horrifying Jack the Ripper murders and the moral and social depravities that contributed to them, Moore and Campbell explore the roots of the rise of the modern serial killer, considering him the product of the dark vices and obsessions of Victorian society. The vicissitudes of the past are focused on a climatic point in the universal history of infamy, tackling the hypothetical and appalling reconstruction of the Ripper murder, based on the well-known conspiracy theory according to which Prince Edward Albert Victor, known as Eddie, second in line to the British throne, and Queen Victoria herself were respectively the source and the designer of the iniquitous murders of at least 5 prostitutes in Whitechapel in the so-called Autumn of Terror of 1888, a crucial episode from a contemporary ideological viewpoint in the history of patriarchal violence against women, centered here on the figure of Sir William Gould, Her Majesty's physician. In this vein, From Hell constitutes another brick in the wall of the profuse subgenre of the so-called Ripper literature. In the supreme elusiveness and ambiguity that have contributed to confer him the category of modern myth, Jack the Ripper becomes a metaphor of many different things, a polysemous symbol that, as seen from Moore's and Campbell's perspective, assumes multiple connotations and interpretations. First and foremost, the murderer is the dark emblem of the incessant and systematic patriarchal repression and eradication of any form of female power, as evidenced by the London Tour carried out in Chapter 4 by the Freemason William Gull and the coachman John Netley, who traversed the labyrinthine map of the imperial metropolis, following the symbolic and esoteric pattern of a pentacle. London is the city of dreadful delight, the literature of stones, with its phallic obelisks, its brusque social and ideological contrasts, its pompous monuments and filthy slums. The capital of the British Empire becomes the gloomy and dual setting for the unbalanced war between, on the one hand, lost and ancestral matriarchy, and on the other, claustrophobic, violent, and merciless patriarchy. One of the medical specialties of Gull, the misguided visionary, is that of the treatment of madness, a category in which any Victorian woman that did not correspond to the archetype of the angel in the house was in danger of being confined. Being an exclusively masculine realm in the Victorian period, medicine is figured out as an aggressive menace to the female mind and body, envisaged as fragmented, torn out, and dismembered by both Gull and the coroners. The disjecta membra of the mutilated victim can be metaphorically identified as fragments of individual and collective history, announcing by extension the decay of a ruthless and indifferent society, leading to the dismemberment of the British Empire itself. The Reaper, a collective creation backed up by the tabloid press of the time, turns into the icon and outcome of his age, the same as, for example, Dorian Gray or Dracula, late Victorian literary archetypes. Moore is deeply convinced that late Victorian society contributed to the rise and invention of Jack the Ripper as an emblem of communal evil. Through William Gull's words to his coachman, after the hideous dismemberment of Marie Kelly's body, Moore makes us aware of the fact that Jack's last murder is not the end, but just the beginning of a grim and frightening process. Quote, "For better or worse, the 20th century, I have delivered it." End of quote. It is utterly ironical and paradoxical that this bloodthirsty antagonist and destroyer of women boasts of his capacity of giving birth to a whole century, symbolically and linguistically usurping female creative power. As a callous member of the Victorian high class, Gull despises women and all those that he considers sexually or racially other, like the Jews. As we are duly informed from Hell and other sources, there were some 12,000 prostitutes in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. The squalor of the place, inhabited by immigrants and representatives of the industrial proletariat, was notorious. This state of moral and social decay, in spite of some individual examples of generosity, solidarity, tenderness, and affection, mainly between characters pertaining to the lower classes, for instance, son of the prostitutes, or Inspector Frederick Aberline himself, pervades the whole narrative, evincing the ailments of a characteristically diseased society. Moore understands that the Reaper's modernity lies in his ability to become an iconic repository of obscure drives and desires, a phenomenon to which the Victorian press contributed to a large degree. Jack's technological offspring has gone forth and multiplied in our times, and now is obliquely observed in the proliferation of violent news in the social networks, the internet, video games, and other forms of entertainment. In the cynical and skeptical background of the postmodern and the Neo-Victorian age, fictional serial killers, as for example Hannibal Lecter or Dexter, can easily become popular and likable heroes. Alan Moore reflects masterfully on the interaction of the Victorian past and the present through the deeds and thoughts of William Gould, immersed in what criminologists call the aura phase, a time in which killers who have committed or are about to commit their murders have strange vision and hallucinations. After dissecting the body of Catherine Eddowes, Gould raises his arms triumphantly in front of a modern skyscraper, the symbolic counterpart of Nicholas Hawksmoor's sinister towers. And in the middle of the most dramatically impressive and bloody dismemberment, that of the supposed Marie Kelly, the startled physician finds himself in a modern office where workers are using their computers and mobile phones. The infamous murderer thinks that he is catching a glimpse of apocalypse. From Hell is a vademecum of Victorian history, agglutinating a plethora of real and strictly fictional characters, both illustrious and popular. Some relevant examples of the former are Queen Victoria, Prince Eddie, John Merrick, the Elephant Man, William Butler Yeats, William Morris, Aleister Crowley, Oscar Wilde, Robert Louis Stevenson, Madame Blavatsky, so on and so forth. This Victorian melting pot, accompanied by a great number of literary, historical, philosophical, and cultural references, would not be complete without the 5 disgraceful victims of Jack the Ripper: Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, Kate Eddowes, and Marie Kelly, to whom From Hell is respectfully and justly dedicated. Their names are indelibly linked to one of the most ill-famed episodes in the history of mankind, and more specifically, of the Victorian era. As Moore and Campbell emphasize on the last page of their impressive narrative, those women also have their contemporary doubles and counterparts, even in the 10 Bells, the Whitechapel pub that they used to haunt. Unfortunately, the looming shadow of Jack the Ripper will be present till gender violence is eradicated to the full extent from the face of the earth. Moore's and Campbell's last image of freedom, evoked by the flight of a bird, implies that there is hope, however small, for this to happen. For this righteous and inalienable purpose, we must fight all together. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Abril Hernández, and I would like to start my presentation by thanking the organizers of the Comics in Dialogue International Conference at Complutense University for giving me the opportunity to share my research. This presentation is entitled W is for Woman and Witchery: Magic Echoes Disclosed in Romantic and Modernist Poetry Through Their Graphic Adaptations. There is a semiotic component in this presentation which is closely tied to the intermediate representation of 2 different poems in the comic form. I will be dealing with 2 poets, the American feminist activist and playwright, apart from poet, Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was born in 1892 and died in 1950. The second poet, I'll be dealing with is John Kitz, the famous Romantic author, who was born in 1795 and died in 1821. I will be studying Millay's sonnet The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge, which was published in the year 1920 in her second collection of poems entitled A Few Figs from Thistles, and I will compare this poem to John Kitz's La Belle Dame sans Merci, which was published in the year 1890. The semiosis at stake in the adaptation of a piece of literature from one medium, such as the written word, to another, for example, graphic adaptations in the form of comics, have been the focus of intermediate semiotics and social semiotics for decades. This process of meaning-making from one medium to another has received different names, such as transduction. Transduction is a name that Gunther Kress gave to this form of adaptation in the year 2005. Other names that this process has received are transmodal operation, given by Wyatt Smith and Kimber, or more recently, transmodal moments by Neufeld in the year 2013. Linda Hudson has affirmed in her study A Theory of Adaptation that, quote, an adaptation is an announced and extensive transposition of a particular work or works. This transcoding can involve a shift of medium, a poem to a film, or genre, an epic to a novel, end of quote. The British semiotician Gunther Kress and the Dutch linguist Theo van Leeuwen published in the year 1996 their famous book Reading Images, The Grammar of Visual Design. This book meant a magnificent momentum in the field of semiotic multimodal communication studies. Although they mainly analyzed banner adverts on paper, they are credited with being among the first scholars to provide a deeply semiotic explanation for the cognitive mechanisms of coding and decoding multimodal language. I will now provide a brief introduction to the two poems analyzed hereafter. Kitz's ballad La Belle Dame sans Merci is a narrative poem in which an unnamed anonymous narrator warns a knight-at-arms, as Kitz says, about the doomed fate of all knights that have fallen prey of this fairy's child, as he calls this woman. At no point in this poem do we hear the voice of this femme fatale, and we totally ignore her motivation or aim in her proceeding. In Millay's poem, The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge, we hear the protagonist's voice wondering, "What should I be?" which is repeated several times in different stanzas throughout the poem. This is repeated with slight variations, and this sonnet is half autobiographical in view of the details that the author gives, such as the fact that the woman in the poem is described as, quote, the fiend's goddaughter. This woman saw her parents separate just like Millay herself witnessed the traumatic divorce of her parents when she was only 8. In his enigmatic ballad La Belle Dame sans Merci, John Kitz presents an uncanny atmosphere in which the only character who seems to be in her home is a murderous lady, the woman in the poem, compared by some critics with Kitz's unattainable lover Fanny Brawne. The lady in this ballad is presented as a fallen woman, a temptress. This holds connections with Millay's own woman in the second poem. The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge is one of Millay's most light-hearted poems, and it narrates in vivid language the story of a first-person narrator since she was born. With noticeable autobiographical details, Millay originally entitled this poem The Changeling, the Hybrid. She drew on classical poetic forms such as the ballad, which is also one of Kitz's preferred forms, and romantic tropes in order to subvert the view of women in traditional poetry. Contrary to what happened in Kitz's poem and in Peter's adaptation, Millet's The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge and Kolitsky's graphic version both focused largely on the character of the narrator, relegating men to a second role. As you can see on these two images, I will be dealing with the principles of composition of multimodal texts. These have been analyzed by Gunther Kress and Theo van Leeuwen, and these are the salience, framing, and information value of images. Let's start with the salience in Kitz's poem. As we can see in the upper panel in the first image, the lady in John Kitz's La Belle Dame sans Merci is presented from a long shot. There are also flowers, and the gaze of this woman in the lower panels focus our attention on the lady, on her eyes, her sight. For Millet's part, we have the red hair that is the most salient element in the graphic adaptation. In The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge, the protagonist of this poem, this girl, this woman, has red hair, and this is one of the most visually appealing elements in the poem, in the graphic version of the poem. And we know that this red hair has evil symbolism. It has had so throughout time. Framing is the way in which the images are encapsulated in the poem. This is the second principle of composition identified by Kress and van Leeuwen. In Kitz's poem, the lady is not framed in most cases, whereas the man is encapsulated in the frames, in the panels. As these two semioticians have identified, being framed for an image encompasses a sense of being within the limits of time, so that the lady, who is in most of the panels not framed, represents something that goes beyond time. She transcends time. Opposed to this view, we have in Millet's poem the graphic version of The Singing Woman from the Woodsedge, showing most characters and mostly all panels with a double framing line, which represents that the character who is speaking, the narrator herself, is alienated from her social milieu, which makes sense considering that she is living in the woods, separated from society. The third principle of composition identified by these two scholars is information value. If we start with Kitz's poem, the information value refers to the organization of the elements on the panel. The lady, as we can see on the upper panel, is represented in the upper right part. This section of the panel is normally devoted, as these scholars have noted, to the new information that is provided. It is also often connected to the idea, that which is not real. Contrary to this representation, the man is presented in a lower right section of the panel. This corresponds to that which is known and that which is real. Here we can see the two protagonists, the two characters in this graphic version by Julian Peters, represented in different planes in the same panel. For her part, the comic adapted by Joy Kolitsky of Millet's poem represents the girl in the lower right part of the panel, which represents that which is known and that which is real. As a conclusion, we can see that there is a sense of liminality in both poems. Not only are the characters in both poems represented in the graphic versions very visually in the limen, in the border of the woods, in their corresponding woods. They are at the Woodsedge, both characters, the man in Kitz' poem, the female narrator in Millais' poem. There is a perpetual process of quest for the I. This is most clearly seen in Millais' recurrent repetition, what should I be, with different endings for this question. However, in Kitz' presentation, we have a half-dead man lying at the edge of a wood, and a lady who is presented as an evil creature here in the form of a witch. At the end of Millais' poem, the adaptation shows that Millais has decided to present in her poem a protagonist who walks away, and the graphic designer of this poem has imitated this movement towards the outside of the forest, towards the outside of the woods of this narrator. She walks away from the edge after all the rhetorical questions, what should I be? Interestingly enough, the poem in Millais ends with what should I be but just what I am. That is the last line of the poem, which would mean that in a way she has found the answer to this question. To conclude, the visual depiction of these two women in both pieces of poetry is accurately transposed in their respective comic adaptations by the two graphic designers, Joy Kolitsky and Julian Peters, and they provide complementary visions of women. Peters draws a temptress who bears all the attributes of the femme fatale in Kitz' poem, while Kolitsky shows the young woman in Millais' own sonnet. The enfantine images in the latter comic do not speak of a less strong personality than that of the captivating lady in the former.
Hello, my name is María Augusta Albuja Aguilar, and I'm going to talk to you about To Kill a Mockingbird graphic novel as part of the Comics in Dialogue conference. Stories as human beings need to adapt in order to evolve and also to migrate to other contexts and formats. Therefore, adaptations always imply change, no matter how familiar a narrative may seem, as it's the case of Harper Lee's Pulitzer Prize winner novel To Kill a Mockingbird, which has been adapted not only to the '62's Oscar winner film, but also in the recent years to Broadway, and in 2018, British artist Fred Fordham took this story to the comic format. The graphic novel translates most of Lee's story in the same chronological order. It starts in the summer of 1933 and goes until 1935, revolving around the residents of Macomb County, and especially the Finch family. The children, Scout and Jem, have adventures with their new friend Deal, trying to trespass the Radley's property to meet their reclusive neighbor Boo, while their father Atticus is appointed to defend Tom Robinson, an African-American wrongly accused of raping a white woman named Mayola Ewell. Any revision of a book that has been labeled as a modern American classic poses a challenge because of all the possible comparisons to the original. However, Hudson argues that an adaptation should not be judged in the lens of its fidelity to the source, but regarding its creativity. Far from intending to compare the graphic novel with the original or a different adaptation, this analysis aims at understanding the importance of a reinterpretation in a format that can bring new light, freshness, and accessibility to a story that, as it will be argued, deserves to be revisited. First, I will explain how space and time are portrayed in the story. Then I will dive into the analysis of the unique narrative resources, metaphors, and symbols employed in the comic. And finally, I will approach the graphic novel from a sociopolitical perspective and argue on the advantages of the adaptation in this format. Overall, we find that the visual aesthetic has an imprint of the author's interest in the long tradition of the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée. Fordham combines characters that are not completely realistic, keeping a cartoonish touch, with entirely realistic landscapes. In fact, The author visited Lee's old home in Monroeville, Alabama, which was the inspiration for Macomb, and so what he draws in the adaptation is essentially a mirror image of that town. While a prose text has to describe one event or setting after another, the comic can show everything at one glance, like in real life, and convey immediacy. The story, narrated by a scout, starts showing Macomb from a high angle, which in the following panels closes up to the main characters. The display of the panels in the graphic novel is mostly conventional, but the color composition offers an original outlook. Forham did the drawings digitally, but manually added mixed watercolor washings to bring texture to the pastel illustrations. The use of color in the graphic novel provides a vintage aesthetic that helps to recreate the period in which it is settled, while also emphasizing important aspects of the narration. For example, flashbacks are mostly portrayed in black and white or in grey color palette, which brings a cinematic feeling to the reader experience. And to highlight certain dialogues, characters are usually drawn placed against a white background. Silences are captured too, which happens in the enigmatic scene near the end, when Atticus and Scout are hugging while Burr Bradley is sitting at their left on the swing and looking down. The graphic novel is filled with beautifully crafted illustrations of the countryside, natural representations of seasons, the weather changes, and other sceneries of the town. Apart from the color, the light and shadows when characters are sitting in the porches during the summer, or when a scene happens at night, make Macomb another character in the story. We know that films add another medium that represents images and words, times, and space. Poynter and Bosenhoff claim that it seems to be more dismissal towards comic adaptations than to film adaptations in terms of their faithfulness to the original literary source. However, comics have advantages on choreographing and shaping time. In this format, the author has not only to decide the general structure as in movies, but what to put on each page, so there is the possibility to juxtapose past, present, and future at one glance. For example, the Finch family history is presented in a splash page over a map pointing the route their ancestor took to arrive at Macomb. A sailing ship is drawn in the upper background, and this is followed by a forefront image of slaves working on a cotton plantation. On the page at the right, we see Macomb and the Finch family at present. The comic format has also fewer time restrictions than a film. It can compress everything in a few panels or either take several tires to convey the slow passing of time of a particular sequence of actions. In the graphic novel, the moment when a scout accompanies Burr Bradley back to his house is portrayed in this way. We can see the whole route, and even the moment when Boo is opening the door is extended. This display is important because it encourages readers to feel the pace from the point of view of the characters, which also happens when showing a routine. In the graphic novel, different drawings of the children playing during the summer are presented with fluidity, capturing repetition and movement. As for posing the narrative, exterior images are represented. For example, during the trial, after the tire dedicated to Atticus' interrogation to Tom Robinson, we see this panel showing the view of the court from outside. In the next panels, the trial is resumed. Unlike a film where the duration of each scene is already established, in a comic the reader is free to spend as much time as wanted or needed in each panel. So even if the general order of the scene is predetermined by the artist's preconception, readers still have freedom concerning how they approach and interpret it. It has been traditionally considered that words are destined to tell a story, while images are better suited for showing. However, in comics, readers pick up clues from both, and the two modes work together toward unfolding the narrative. Words in comics are not only there to describe the setting and events, but they can also show the characters' actions, especially through onomatopoeias, while images can tell through their composition and the characters' bodies. The panels dedicated to Tom Robinson's reaction after hearing his verdict are a great example. The word guilty is first shown in a black background, which gives the sensation of hearing it from the scout's perspective, who is closing her eyes, on the panel before, but at the same time from Tom's perspective, who has his eyes closed in the upcoming 3 panels. Tom's facial expressions portrays his feeling of deception, impotence, and frustration. Kukkonen states that an adaptation which translates a classic for a new audience places it into a new context and suggests new perspectives. Fortham's graphic novel shows us scenes that in the story are not experienced by Scout as the narrator or the main characters, and so in Lee's novel are not shown, but only told through a third person. Burr Bradley's story of why his family locked him in their house, Deals made up adventures to explain how he had escaped from his parents' home and arrived at Macomb, Tom Robinson's account of what happened between him and Mayella Ewell and his escape attempt and death, are shown and not only told in the graphic novel. So the author, as a previous reader of the source, shows his interpretation, taking the place of the audience. Another way of appealing to readers is by keeping the tension in the narration. For example, when Atticus is preparing to shoot a dog with rabies that appears in the street, there is this subject-to-subject sequence of him pointing the gun and of the sick dog approaching, which gives the tension and the anxiety of the moment. Forkham chooses to show rather than tell the adventure of the children trying to trespass the Radleys' property. Without words, the audience could feel directly how the characters are trying to remain silent, walking on their tiptoes not to be discovered. Even when they see someone appear, he is portrayed as a shadow, and so it retains the ambiguity of the moment. According to Kokoni, comics have been generally considered to be less literary than novels since they seem to represent less cognitive complexity and offer a less perplexing reading experience. As this author, I have also proved wrong some of these preconceived ideas towards the format. Now I will refer to some others concerning the symbolic analysis in this graphic novel. One familiar metaphor in the story is the comparison of Boo Radley to a mockingbird. In the graphic novel, it is represented through these panels showing the exteriors of the Finch's house, while Scout and Jem discuss their views on the families of the town. We see that a mockingbird is standing on the fence. When Jem says that he understands why Boo Radley would prefer to stay at home, the bird flies away. Shute explains how comics have a double-coded narrative because images and text that are presented together may mean different, but remain complementary for narrative purposes. This moment shows the hybridity of semantics that words and images are able to bring to a graphic novel because while Boo does not leave the nest, the mockingbird sings and then flies free. Another important moment in the story is when Tom Robinson tries to escape the prison and he is shot dead by the prison guards. This double-page spread with striking drawings show Atticus and Calpurnia telling the awful news to Tom's wife while she's in the grass crying disruptly. This drawing overlaps with a big image of her face highlighting her desperate expression and another showing Tom Robinson shot dead with his fingers touching the fence. His body blurs and dissolves with the grass. The collage technique with overlapped images of the same characters on different sizes is once again employed when referring to Mayella's loneliness during the trial and when Scout recognizes Boo Radley near the end of the story. The way the characters are drawn helps to emphasize how they are struggling with mental health disorders. To Kill a Mockingbird also deals with other difficult themes such as segregation, racism, gender roles, rape, coming of age, social classes, and especially white male privilege. Even though this story is settled in the 30s, the novel and its film adaptation appeared during the 60s, a period that witnessed the emergence of the African American, the second wave feminists, and other important social movements. Hutchins argues that the socio-cultural context in which we experience the adaptation is an important factor in the significance we grant to this form and helps determine what is repressed or accentuated in terms of racial and gender politics. The 2018 adaptation was able to include most of Harper Lee's text. On a proscript note on why racial slur was also translated to the graphic novel, Forkham explains how its dehumanizing power and ease with which was used is central to understanding the themes of the novel. We believe that this decision also applies to other expressions rendered to the new format that have been recognized as microaggressions. For example, when James refers to a Scout as behaving like a girl in a diminishing way, or when on the topic of religion women are associated with impurity and sin. After all, discourse shapes social constructions and is also a product of it. For instance, the first time a black person is mentioned in the narration, the panel only shows the person's legs while walking, a choice that could be interpreted as trying to represent someone faceless for that society. However, when the trial is almost done, a panel of Tom Robinson's face at the forefront is juxtaposed with a picture of Atticus telling the jury at the background to do their duty. This moment portrays white privilege in one panel, an appeal for accountability for what has been done, not only for the fact that the one guilty for abusing Mayella, which is never drafted in the narration, appears to be her own father, but also for the bigoted accusation. Even if Hutchins' A Theory of Adaptation was published at the beginning of this century, we agree when she says that the time is clearly right in the United States as elsewhere for adaptations of works in the timely topic of race. Because racial minorities, as the Black Lives Matter movement proves, have not stopped to be wrongly accused of crimes and to suffer from police brutality. I would say that conceptions of women and gender roles are also timeless topics that need to be brought again to our context, and not only because sexual aggressions to women, as the Me Too movement shows, have not stopped to happen since the 30s or the 60s, but also since gender constructions and roles still rule our society at present. In this context, boyhood and girlhood are portrayed on several pages in the story, since the point of view comes especially from the Finch siblings. For example, when Scout as the narrator explains that after proposing Dill has neglected her even if she punched him a few times, and that now she spends more time with her neighbor. Mrs. Muddy is shown on the next page with hard facial features working on her garden, while on the next panel she is sitting in her porch wearing a dress, while the scout explains that this character is a sort of chameleon. The confusing ideas towards sex and gender constructions that the scout sees is that for a man being a boy and a gentleman is considered positive, while for a woman being a girl or even a tomboy is not, she can only be a lady. This means that coming of age for a male and a female is different when regarded socially, which is another topic captured in the graphic novel. Adaptation of a particular narrative emerged because of the continuing historical, sociocultural, and psychological relevance. This comic adaptation brings back a story that might be important during these times of reemergence of nationalistic governments and xenophobic and anti-feminist movements and policies. According to Schut, form and politics intertwine in this format that is capable of materializing history and aspiring to ethical engagement. Harper Lee's novel has been read for a long time within formal education. Hodgson explains how adaptations like this are important for young readers because they are capable of bringing literature to a larger public, cutting away the literacy differences that come from a lack of access. So this graphic novel could appeal to a new audience and also provide the feeling that it is a recreational reading different from the novel in the required lists. Besides, as Hatfield states, the fissure between adult-sanctioned and self-selected children's reading is boldly marked regarding comics. To Kill a Mockingbird novel has also suffered from controversial and contradictory reception since its publication 80 years ago. Therefore, the graphic novel may carry these burdens, but it should not be dismissed. Neither because the comic format has been underestimated, because as we have seen, it possesses numerous narrative advantages, and neither for being an adaptation, since it helps a story told from the perspective of young characters to age well and to appeal to new generations. We could say that the graphic novel as a Mockingbird just does one thing, sings its heart out to us.